Subcultures are an interesting phenomena. Big or small, each one has something interesting to offer, and they can take shape and form into just about anything. While for us here in the West, we predominantly have images of punks, goths, and maybe even 2000s emos come to mind. But music isn't the only thing that can bring a collective group of people together. Fashion can do just the same, which is pretty easy to see when we look at the Lolita fashion or even steampunk movements. And even on more serious subjects such as the niche 70s cypherpunks, who were essentially a collective of people gathered around data encryption and anonymity during the early days of computers, subcultures can essentially be formed out of just about anything. So with that in mind, it almost begs the question, what do some of these look like once we leave the Western bubble? Well, moving just about anywhere outside of the West, you'll find a whole host of different subcultures. Some that might be pretty similar to what we have here, and others which are vastly different. For example, we have the Russian Gopniks, or Slavs in general, our Adidas-wearing, liquor-loving squatter friends blasting hard bass to their heart's content. Not too dissimilar to maybe some people that you might find here in the West. But then you also have something like the Japanese and Thai, spandex-clad boys just out to have a good time. Something a bit more weird and out there compared to what we would see here, but still a very interesting rabbit hole nonetheless. So, what about countries that are more totalitarian and authoritative? What about a place that has soul-crushing working conditions and not exactly, shall we say, accepting natures to individuality? Well, in that case, we would have China's most despised and hated Shamate. Under mountains of hair gel and dye emerges the pain and anxiety of a generation of left-behind children, the loneliness and monotony of factory work, and the way such a parched existence can become fodder for a massive movement of creativity and expression. The Shamate are a subculture mostly composed of migrant youth and young adults, originating from the rural farmlands of China. There are kids who were brought to the big cities with the promise of better jobs, better wages, and a new lease on life, only to be met with the overwhelming reality of dread that is the life of a Chinese factory worker. Shit pay, grueling hours, and mistreatment from the office-working upper class that sees them as little more than uneducated, worthless country bumpkins. The Shamate are a subculture defined by their odd and flamboyant aesthetics, which serve as not only a form of peacocking, but as a light to those around them, finding community, hope, and belonging with each other. So just what would a subculture like this look like? To the uncultured swine, you look and see scene kids, dressed and ready to take on the eternal summer that is Warped Tour. To those more familiar with Asian music, you might see a Chinese rendition of Visual Kei, but these are none other than the Shamate, a working class group of rebels who defied the rules and expectations posed on them and found hope in wild hairstyles, cheap hair dye, and the confidence of eschewing conformity for the freedom of self-expression. Now look, I know you probably have some questions. You probably have some preconceived judgment for these people. So without further ado, let's just see what these people are all about. Because just by looking at them, it's easy to write them off and not see what they're actually about, and only see them for the flash and flare and flamboyance in front of you. So why don't we talk about China's most misunderstood subculture. Let's talk about the Shamate.
外工资很低的，一般10、11、12块了。去其他地方的话13块了，零职工。去年我去东坑那个什么富港富东那个集团排到20块钱1个小时哦，做临时的厂里面执照的，好多人去抢着排队哦，打架。我去那里，最起码一天排1000多个。
罗福星是一个什么样的人？本质上，我觉得他就是个人呢，一个活生生的人呢，一个可爱的人呢，是吧？没有变化的啊，成了自己最讨厌的人，去理解杀马特是什么？我现在不会。
Alright, now that you've got your gawking out of the way, let's just talk about just where these neon-haired techno junkies came from. In most cases, subcultures are spawned by an amalgamation of various figures or influences that commingle over time, whether it be a small group of bands who have crossover or some various fashion trends that mix over time. In general, these sorts of things kinda just come together naturally and slowly. But in the case of the Shamate, you could really trace the whole thing back to one main figure.
我叫罗福星，杀马特的创始人。其实我们当时很多玩杀马特的人，基本上都是在一些小厂里面上班，像平常在工厂也没啥事干，是吧？除了上网、打打游戏、逛逛公园。
Luao Fuxsing, an eccentric hairstylist from China, who for the better part of 10 years would act as the patriarch and ringleader of the Shamate family. This was all born out of the fact that at 11 years old, Luao discovered the Japanese idol and rock star Miyavi. Miyavi himself is an artist with a long and interesting history, being a longtime staple in Japanese pop culture, a beloved personality, a guitar player, but most importantly for Luao, an artist who indulged in the visual kei genre and aesthetic. In awe of the fashion, makeup, and hairstyles that Miyavi had showed off, it would all come to heavily inspire Luao, who would opt to get his hair styled similarly to him. By sheer chance, I found a photo of Japanese music star Miyavi. I haven't heard his name before or listened to his songs. I also had no idea what rock, punk, or gothic genres were like, but I found his style appealing, and I wanted to be as cool as he was. I downloaded his picture and went to our village's only hair salon, telling them I wanted this style. When it was finished, I felt that it was so unique and belonged only to me. After that, whenever I had the time, I'd stay at home alone, give myself a new hairstyle, and pair it with makeup and accessories. You could buy a whole set of cosmetics at a kiosk back then for 100 yuan. My favorite style was the side fringe covering one of my eyes. It's so cool. I would upload my photos online along with Miyavi's. I lied to my classmates and my online friends, telling them that Miyavi was also a Shamate. Nobody in my village had heard much about foreign stars, so they didn't know Miyavi and didn't doubt me. As I'm sure most of you know, China's pretty strict on what it lets its citizens see and indulge in from outside countries. Hence the Great Firewall of China, internet censorship, and the general restrictions thereon. The separation of TikTok and Douyin is not a new phenomena. It's been a long time standard for how China operates. Western versions of websites and social media have just about always been a far cry from the heavily moderated and curated versions of their own home counterparts. China is a culture that thrives off of hierarchy and conformity, so outside influences that could challenge the status quo are generally things that the powers that be would rather prefer to keep outside. Where all this really connects with Luo is that after he got his stylish haircut and began dressing in his new VK-inspired fashion, the selfies he took and the looks he showed off on social media would begin to amass a bit of a following. And by tagging it all with the label Shamate, a poor translation of the English word smart, the pieces would begin to come together. In a matter of months, the allure and intrigue around Luo's fashion sense would begin to amass not only a following, but many imitators. People eager to don their own colorful, vibrant hairstyles and also brand themselves as Shamate. In seeing this, Luo would start a guerrilla marketing campaign encouraging others to recruit people to the Shamate and create an internal hierarchy, organizing groups on web forums, chat rooms, and eventually creating his own hubs for growing masses of Shamate to congregate online. But before we delve into that, we should probably get a better understanding of just who Luo was. Mr. Fuxsing himself grew up in a rural country village. Estranged from his parents, who more or less left him to be raised by his grandparents to pursue better opportunities within China's growing manufacturing industry, seeking out higher pay and more opportunities in the city. Luo would spend his free time in internet cafes and web surf, and as I said before, he would eventually discover Japanese Visual Kei and from there begin his journey to define the identity and name of the Shamate. To be honest, one of the reasons why I thought Shamate was interesting was because everyone would pay attention to me. It was like my father finally noticed my existence. I often had to move around during my childhood and was left behind by my parents who went to the city for better jobs. They were always busy working and didn't have a good relationship. When I was 6, I was sent to live with my grandparents. Now, not to go into a whole other tangent, but something important to bring up for the context of all this is that China is very different from the West in terms of domestic migration. Here in America, we can move from state to state with little to no real requirements or restrictions. Simply load up your car or hop on a plane, and if you can afford the fare, you can go just about anywhere within the country. Vagabonding from Colorado to New York, to California to Texas, and if you really want to live there, it's as simple as finding an apartment and visiting the DMV to get your license registered in the state. Now, this is an absolute far cry from China, where cities and regions in general are held up in tiers. Insert the Hoko system, which depending on the region you reside or you're born in, determines what cities and regions you're legally allowed to live in.
But what is a hukou? Some people liken it to a passport to life in China. Without one, a person cannot get an ID card, legally register for school, get married, open a bank account, or access health insurance.
And to make this all the more draconian, Hoko also determines what social media sites you're even allowed to use, taking region locking to a whole other level. So if you're a farmer from the rural areas of China and worse off, from a more looked down upon ethnicity like the Yao people from Gulian or the Yi people from Yunnan, you're probably going to be stuck in a lower end city classed in a lower tier like Guangdong, a far cry from a capital such as Beijing. So for someone like Luo, it's easy to see why something as simple as colored hair would be so liberating. The Shamate label gave him a sense of identity and freedom, something he needed once he migrated to a city himself and began his life as a factory worker. I dropped out of school when I was in 7th grade and went to see my father, who was working in Shenzhen. To look for a job, I worked at a hardware factories first, but they had strict dress codes. I had to tie my hair up during work, and I had very little leisure time on weekends to create my own hairstyles. I got spider tattoos on my elbows after I saw in a movie that prisoners in America have spider webs that are made bigger the longer they're in jail. I thought that the factory was pretty similar to prison. The profound part of that quote would be the "I thought the factory was pretty similar to prison" bit, because it was that sentiment alone that would come to encapsulate the Shamate and all those who would find themselves within their ranks. The backbreaking labor for pennies on the dollar, the mistreatment and outright hatred for merely being a migrant worker from the country by people who saw you as little more than a drone to slave away out of sight and out of mind. Once Luo got a taste of the attention and a feeling like he was something more than just a drone, it would begin his mission to raise the Shamate to as high as he possibly could. People who mock the Shamate are probably middle class. By cursing me, they want to show off that they have cars and apartments. People want to vent their anger, and Shamate get caught in the crossfire. These people discriminate against the underclass, but they never stop to think that there must be a reason for this subculture to exist. Moving from the village to the city and starting to work at that young of an age, I felt isolated. I was weak. But under the guise of the Shamate, I felt strong. Now, to bring up the main event as you will. To put it simply, the Shamate is a subcultural movement that protests not with active riots, violence, or even picket signs and bumper sticker slogans, but rather by indulging in a bright, transgressive sense of fashion and existing in a way that defies the status quo. Now, in the Western world, we see pictures like this and instantly think, "Ah, man, I remember my scene days," before the creeping sense of shame hits us while an insufferable Broken Side song worms its way back into our memory. But hey, let's take that Western-centric view of the world and put it aside for a moment. Outside of the colorful fringe and some blingy MySpace gifs that decorate their websites and profiles, the similarities between these groups are more or less non-existent. More accurately, the Shamate derive much of their spirit and identity from 70s punks from the UK and the previously mentioned Japanese visual kei. The Shamate's links to punk, though, only kind of exist, mostly in the fact that they were both birthed out of a desire to use artistic and physical expression to stand against what they perceived to be authoritarian abuse and conformity. But like most Western influences, this was relatively minimal. If you wanted to find links or connections, most of them are serendipitous at best, if anything just a logical response to conditions of corporate and authoritarian abuse. Visual kei, on the other hand, was a far larger player in what developed the Shamate. As we talked about in our last section, the look was inspired by Miyavi, though not because of his music or even ideology. For those unfamiliar with visual kei, it's a scene of music more defined by its aesthetics and fashion than the actual sound of the music. Hence why you can find bands playing anything from soft alternative rock to straight up deathcore. Even the VK aesthetic is pretty varied, from the modern gothic look to the French aristocratic style of bands like Malice Miser, or the edgy and dark style of Duran Grey, or even bands outside the realm of visual kei that take minor cues from it, like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, who, despite putting this out years after the fact and in a country far removed from the scene, produced the most 2009 video that I've ever seen. This was the look that would come to inspire the Shamate the most. Adopting the flamboyant and androgynous look, colorful and massive hair, and gaudy garish clothing. The drip, if you will, was real. But the Shamate were more than just fashion, they were also a lifestyle. The only true parallel that the Shamate had with the West's scene kids was their vapid love of the internet, taking to social media and chat rooms to share their interests, shoot the shit, and slowly spread themselves across the net. Just replace MySpace, AOL, and Bebo with Chinese internet forums and QQ chat rooms. But unlike our side of the pond, most of these corners were more or less walled off, where you would need to be accepted by the Shamate to enter their domain. Which brings us to one of the most key and important aspects. The Shamate didn't operate quite like any other subculture. You couldn't just listen to the music, don the look, and head out to Warped Tour or Das Bunker and mingle with the scene. You had to be accepted. The Shamate often referred to each other as a family, as well as used the word to describe the collective movement. It had a hierarchy to it as well, with people in different positions of importance, power, and influence. It really came together to give the whole thing a much more real feel to it. But hey, maybe you're wondering what the Shamate did for fun. Well, in that case, they would hold meetups in shopping districts and parks, hanging out in mass and giving them a unified public presence, clashing against any of the typical scenery and faces that would be expected in your average Chinese city. Not only was this good for bonding and creating genuine friendships and community, but it worked as free advertising to anyone who saw them and took an interest. But this was far from the most entertaining aspect of who the Shamate were. I think the most left field but interesting aspect about them is actually the fact that roller skating was a staple of their culture. It's nothing crazy, but just another interesting aspect to see. And that's a big theme of the Shamate as well. Almost all their interests converge in weird ways, but fit like puzzle pieces that really builds up that mystique that they had of being these colorful, vibrant characters. Other things that they would get up to was obviously raving and hosting parties, even getting together at times to make their infamous concrete dance videos, which have seen quite a bit of notoriety over the years. And like any subculture, there was a predominant genre of music that they would gather around. And while a lot of people would look at these guys and think, oh, they must be bumping Malice Miser or the Gazette, since they're so inspired by Visual Kei, the reality is the genre of choice that they had was happy hardcore and borderline nightcore kind of stuff. Like I said before, it's like a bunch of puzzle pieces that come together, and when you look at them individually, it's odd and doesn't make any sense, but all put together, it's its own beautiful picture, as strange and kind of funny as it is. Now, by this point, I'm sure you're getting a basic idea of just who these people were. They were an eclectic bunch that really enjoyed over-the-top fashion, Visual Kei aesthetics, electronic music, and mostly having a lighthearted and fun time. It really kind of fights off that bad rep that they received, when the reality is that they were just harmless. They were just an odd group of people that enjoyed playing on the internet, crashing roller rinks, and chilling in parks, showing off their dance moves with concrete. A far cry from the delinquent, violent thugs that many people portrayed them as. But I guess that's kind of where we need to segue now. The labels thrust upon them were all purely done out of spite and disgust of just who they were. They weren't hated because of their taste in music. They weren't hated for having fun on their days off. What they were attacked for and ostracized for was simply having the gall to actually unify together and do what they can to create a signal of hope and a better life for themselves. Well, I'm sure some people genuinely just hated the hair and makeup. The reality is all that was an easier way of seeing just who they were. A bunch of farmer kids who need to stay in their place and stay out of the limelight. And this became very apparent because the bigger the Shamate's numbers got, the more resentment against them would grow. And after some steady growth from 2009 to 2013, and the twilight days of the Shamate would begin to come to an end.
8岁我就出来，刚刚上到6年级。
小学4年级没读完我就出来了。
小学文化5年级，11岁就来混。
我上的12岁我就没上了。
我下来的时候是14还是15岁？
那时候我那个13岁还没满的时候，然后就是当时在我们那个村的话，就是说女孩子读书读的比较少，我2年级都没毕业。
读到初2，1个星期。
我上学上到初1。
12岁吧，12岁的时候就出来了。
那时候大概是14岁左右吧。
Something that I've been mentioning throughout this video is that this subculture was far deeper than simply peacock hair and flashy clothes. And that's the tragic reality that this entire thing was birthed of true unbridled oppression. The clip that just played comes from an eye-opening documentary called We Were Smart, which includes many interviews with the Shamate. The constant between just about all of them was the simple fact that these were kids and teenagers thrust from their rural villages into the big cities, pressured and sometimes outright forced to get jobs in factories, working pitiful wages and left to rot and struggle until they die. They were trapped in a life of poverty and slave driving, working 12 to 18-hour days, producing cheap products for mass consumption while not even making enough to afford the basics. The necessity to make ends meet would be exacerbated by deaths and injuries of working parents, leaving many of these kids with no other choice but to dive headfirst into the same conditions that killed their families.
然后我爸他们就出去打工，然后后面我妈，她不是为了挣钱供我们上学嘛，然后那时候我们那里有焦化厂背砖的，然后我亲父母，然后他去背砖，然后从上面摔下来了，然后骨折，然后回家来到家里面，应该有3、4个月吧，躺在床上，然后后面就去世了。然后那时候我姐姐她才读到初2，然后她就说，像我们家这种家庭那么穷，然后你看爸爸又那么辛苦，然后后面他们就去，我姐就想不读书了，然后就去外面打工。
And that Hoko system I mentioned earlier on in the video was a massive player in this as well. So why don't we refer back to that Wall Street Journal video from before?
What are some other implications of the hukou system? There are broadly 2 types of hukou in China, rural and urban, and both entitle the holder to different social services. The system was meant to prevent mass migration from villages to China's cities, but also has meant that many rural migrants live as second-class citizens in urban areas.
In the early 1990s, the People's Republic of China launched their Hoko permit called Blue Stamp. This Hoko was available to a wider population and allowed residents to legally migrate to larger cities. These cities include China's special economic zones, which are known as tax havens for foreign investors. Eligibility for this Hoko was primarily limited to residents with direct relations to local and foreign investors. After joining the World Trade Organization in 2001, China's Hoko system experienced a form of liberation after the country's agricultural sector was impacted by foreign competition and massive job loss. Regulations surrounding work permits were relaxed to accommodate this cultural and economic shift. To put it more directly, the reforms of the blueprint incentivized and allowed for the rural people of the farmlands and agricultural centers of China, all thanks to the need and desire to get as many bodies in factories as possible to pump out products and manufacturing for the Western world, giving the promise of better opportunities and prosperity to the already broken down and second-class citizens of rural China. Now, one of the other more less savory staples of Shamate culture that I left out of the previous section was self-harm. Now, obviously, I can't show you these pictures because YouTube will not have any of it, so they will be blurred. And if you really want to see, you'll need to watch the documentary We Were Smart, which is linked in the description. But many Shamate would take their typical cuts to another level, going as far as carving hearts, words, and sometimes paragraphs into themselves. And yeah, it looks about as painful as it sounds. The trauma of dealing with this sort of lifestyle wasn't something unique to the Shamate, they just happened to be the ones who would try to vocalize their suffering. In an article titled Shamate Speaks for the World of Chinese, it sums up what we're talking about here much better than I ever could. Bai Fei, who left home at 15 years old and now works in a beauty salon in Guangzhou, Guangdong Province, told the camera that she was depressed and that she had been reading online about ways to end her life. When she thought about another woman in the factory who had her hair in 2 or 3 colors and wore stilettos, Bai infused that I could feel the strength of her personality as I was already starting to think, they're free, they're individuals. They were the opposite of my parents. They could do what they wanted. As I got to know them, I realized my life was mine to live, even if I was wrong. It's pretty clear to see that even something as simple as hair dye and clothing could provide so much to those who really have nothing. The Shamate were people who found community and belonging with each other, and the over-the-top fashion and antics were just their way of reclaiming their own individuality and the freedom to express themselves, to be something more than just a second-class citizen locked in a factory to die in poverty. In another article written about the Shamate, Luau would be quoted as saying, "It feels like you're living in a cage. You don't know what's outside. You don't know anything."
然后到那边，因为小，因为当时13岁，进厂也没人要，厂家也不敢收留，然后只能选择捡垃圾，在那个桥下睡觉，没钱住，还没钱吃饭，就一个人嘛。然后慢慢的捡垃圾，捡了2个月，然后找到一家班，然后他说看我还不错了，一家餐饮，然后就叫我去那里上班，给我一点吃的，然后我说不要工资可以，我去那里吃。
So sure, to the majority of the developed world, seeing people with outlandish and attention-grabbing hairstyles isn't that big of a deal, and more often than not, we become a bit desensitized to it. But for those trapped working at the suicide net-laden iPhone factory, it's the little things that matter. Something as small as having an online group to blow off steam with and maybe play games with after work, or even just friends to mob around at the roller rink and park on your day off with, makes all the difference in the world when that's all you actually have. But as we've already established, even this wasn't something that the upper echelon or even the Chinese government would ever truly tolerate. While the first few years of the subculture developing and becoming mainstream were met with some shock and awe, it didn't really hit into high gear until the early 2010s, where come 2013, China would see a large shift in its perspective, going from seeing the Shamate as low-class delinquents to having outright anti-Shamate sentiment come to a boiling point. Their online forums were routinely raided, parodies and mockeries of them would be posted onto social media, songs ripping on them would begin to hit radio waves, and overall the narrative that the Shamate were an open target to direct hatred and negative group to have in society at large became the status quo. There was even a white-collar subculture that was propped up as opposition called Xing. To put it simply, the Xing were an inverse of the Shamate. Their name translates to something like Little Fresh. They were white-collar office workers, often from the upper middle class, who were considered elegant, well-traveled, and educated. A stark contrast to the Shamate, who were elementary school dropouts who lived in cramped and cheap housing and were seen as low-rent, stupid, and offensive. I think the article Stunned, Shattered Shamate Telling the Story of China's Most Hated says it best. Shamate may not have been against the mainstream, but the mainstream was certainly against them. Shamate communities were not just shunned by non-members, but they were safe spaces that were actively invaded and its participants relentlessly targeted. Labeled as underclass style and vulgar, Shamate members were subjected to regular attacks thanks to their blue-collar status and underprivileged rural backgrounds. Shamate were seen as socially unacceptable and went from being the butt of jokes to being deeply despised. Now, just for a reference, why don't we take a look at some of these cities that were home to the Shamate? How do you think it would feel to live in a place that looks like this? Yet you're the asshole stuck in the fog-infested factory while the upper-class corpos look down at you from their dirty high-rises. High-tech, low-class. It's the mantra of cyberpunk. And while you might look at the Shamate and not instantly see it, they were the internet-savvy dregs living in a dystopian city oppressed by the upper class. And like with any dystopian cyberpunk story, our protagonists' lives wouldn't have the happiest of endings. As all the public scrutiny and hatred mounted up, so did the severity of the harassment, leading to them being targeted in public with berating and screaming, and when things got really bad, assault. On the petty level, many anti-Shamate groups, some including foreign bloggers like the one mentioned in the BuzzFeed article, were taking to the web to infiltrate their chat rooms, forums, and other online corners to get into the back end to ban everyone, troll, and cause as much dispersion as they could. There was even a song written about them, guised as a parody, yet in reality, it was little more than just a guise for the deletes to shame and fan the flames of hatred against the Shamate even more. Now, on a much more serious note, I did mention assault, and that was a daily routine for the Shamate come the end of the line. They would often be yelled at or harassed in the streets, and many times even be beaten and attacked. And if rumors are anything to go off of, some were even killed. And given how much negative news is censored in China, let alone what's accessible to us here in the West, it's really hard to tell what's fact or fiction, what is just a rumor and what is reality. All we really do know is that they were hated, they were harassed, and whatever it was serious enough to essentially kill off the Shamate subculture by the mid-2010s. And with the violence faced on the streets, the cracking down of hairstyles and factories, along with the already exploitative backbreaking nature of them, the Chinese upper class going out of its way to make the Shamate's lives a living hell, it would all ultimately end with Luao, the patriarch himself, chopping off his hair and trying to move on. And while the more cynical might see this as him just giving up, it was more than likely a response to the overwhelming pressure that he must have felt at the time. Not only did he birth this subculture himself, but he had spent the entirety of it reigning over as its leader. And with the more and more violence and hatred being cast upon them as the days passed, it's pretty safe to say that he was more than likely feeling responsible and wanted to signal to the rest of his adopted family that the jig was up. And as time passed and, a few years went by, the Shamate would more or less begin to disappear. Not exactly dying off completely, but you wouldn't see them so much in real life anymore. They were mostly online and becoming more and more tight-knit with each other and fading into deeper and deeper corners. The saddest part about all of this was that the Shamate wasn't some sort of crazy gang or a mob of people getting up to nefarious or dangerous activities. Their only crime was being who they were.
打工的人基本上所有人都出去外面打工，不会说待在家里，因为他们坚信着一句话，就是困难困难，困在家里肯定困难，出路，走出去就有路。农村人可能会觉得城里人跟我们是一样，而城里人的人可能有些人会认为跟我农村人跟我们是不一样。
There's a quote from an article that I think really puts this into perspective. They didn't even have complicated concepts such as resistance or rebellion. They were just a bunch of left-out kids who snuggled up together for care and warmth. The truth behind the Shamate is that's all they were. Left behind children coming together to find hope and community. But maybe even that was just a little too much for them to hope for. In the years since all this has played out and the Shamate were more or less banished from society, as always, these sorts of things find ways of living on. And rather than stick to the shadows of the past or hide in some lonely corner of some obscure web forum, the Shamate have actually seen a bit of a rebirth. While not exactly taking the same shape and form that they did during their heyday, this new neo-Shamate class has started to build up its own niche, taking the VK-laden inspirations from the past and crossing it with K-pop sensibilities, and a much less over-the-top yet still flamboyant style, which if I had to guess is probably a bit of a piss take on the little fresh that tormented the former Shamate of yesteryear. And while there are still naysayers, and yeah, this shit does make the rounds on TikTok, it's still extremely enduring to see, and it's good to know that the light that Lua once sparked is still shining bright for a new generation to come. And if this and the handful of other videos about them have anything to say, it's that their influence and legacy are finally starting to see some recognition out here in the West. And hey, maybe here their light can shine even brighter. The Shamate may have had a short-lived and tumultuous existence, and from an outside perspective, an over-the-top and garish look. They represent how something as simple as just clothes and hair dye can make such an impactful statement, lighting a beacon of hope for those who have been left in the dirt and crushed by the weight of society for years. It really goes to show how these little things that we take for granted, like our free time and freedom of expression, and how when those things are taken away, they become so valuable that they're worth more than all the money in the world. And for the Shamate, it gave them a community and a family for those who felt like they had nothing left. So with that, I will bid you adieu.
我情愿钱少一点，我也想把自己的个性这一套给宣传下去，然后让别人知道你自己跟别人与众不同，你有你的优点，你有你的方式方法来生活，而不是说你厂里面怎么说，我们玩杀马特就该怎么去做。
Now before I go, let me just chill for a second here. These are my glorious puppets, my generous pay pigs, the people kind enough to support my content and give me their hard-earned money to help me keep the lights on and make this content free for everyone. I'm eternally grateful, and if you would like to see your name on this wall of shame and bad financial decisions, show me some support on Patreon or buy me a coffee. I couldn't thank you enough, and I'm truly grateful for the support. But with all that being said, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, and I'll see you in the next video.